They called him Scar because of the jagged white line across his throat, but they had no idea that Scar was actually a bullet wound from the night his entire family was massacred. When Scar found that bleeding native girl collapsed under the blazing Arizona sun, he thought he was just saving a stranger from dying of thirst, but she turned out to be the daughter of the most feared Apache war chief in the territory, and what Scar didn't know was that helping her would reveal he wasn't just any drifter, he was the long-lost heir to a silver fortune worth millions, the sole survivor of a family everyone believed was extinct, and the key to preventing a war that could turn the entire Southwest into a bloodbath. But first, he'd have to survive the 30 warriors who were already tracking him across the merciless desert. The sun hammered down on Copper Canyon like the wrath of God that scorching June morning, turning the red sandstone into a furnace that could kill a man in hours. At 23, Scar had learned to move through the desert heat like a ghost, but even he was feeling the brutal temperature as sweat poured down his weathered face. What made him stop wasn't the heat, it was the sight of fresh blood splattered across sun-bleached rocks, still wet despite the murderous sun. But Scar didn't know that this blood belonged to Ayanna Firo, daughter of Chief Lobo Firo, whose Apache warriors had been hunting her attackers for 2 days across the burning wasteland, and he definitely didn't know that she carried intelligence about a planned army massacre that could either prevent a slaughter or trigger the bloodiest Indian war in Arizona history. Following the crimson trail through the shimmering heat, Scar found her crumpled in the meager shade of a towering saguaro cactus, an arrow protruding from her shoulder, her leg twisted at an impossible angle. Her buckskin dress was soaked with blood and sweat, and the merciless sun had already begun to burn her exposed skin. In this heat, without water, she had minutes left. But what stopped Scar cold wasn't her injuries, it was her face. Even unconscious, even dying, she was beautiful in a way that made something deep in his chest ache with recognition, as if he'd been searching for this face his entire life without knowing it. But Scar didn't know that his reaction wasn't coincidence. 15 years earlier, when he was 8 years old, this same girl had given him water from her family's well and taught him to speak Apache before the cavalry came and turned their peaceful meeting into a nightmare of blood and fire. Scar knelt beside her in the blazing heat, his calloused hands already working to stop the bleeding. The arrow was barbed and deep, lodged dangerously close to her heart. Removing it here, in these conditions, with no medical supplies and the desert sun cooking them both, would probably kill her, but leaving it would definitely kill her. "Water," she whispered in English, her cracked lips barely moving. "Please, need water." Scar uncapped his precious canteen, his last water until he reached the next spring 20 miles away, and let precious drops flow between her lips. As the moisture touched her tongue, her eyes fluttered open, fixing on his face with startling intensity. "You," she said, studying his features as if memorizing every line. "I know you." The Scar, just like in grandfather's vision of the burning sky. But Scar didn't know that her grandfather had been the most powerful medicine man of the Apache Nation, and that 3 days before his death, he'd described a vision of a mute white man with a throat scar who would appear when the desert burned red with war, either uniting two peoples or watching them destroy each other in blood. Scar shook his head, trying to indicate he'd never seen her before, but she gripped his wrist with surprising strength despite her weakness. "Your mother," she continued, her voice growing stronger as the water revived her. "She had eyes like winter sky, blue as mountain lakes. She taught you our language when you were small." Images flashed through Scar's mind, fragments that might have been memories or might have been heat mirages. A woman with gentle hands and kind eyes, singing to him in a language he'd forgotten. A small adobe house where he'd felt safe and loved. The taste of cool water from a deep well. But Scar didn't know that these weren't false memories triggered by desert delirium. They were real fragments of his childhood when he was Logan Whitehorse, son of a white mining engineer, and an Apache woman who had defied both cultures to be together. "Logan," she whispered, and the name hit him like a physical blow. "Your real name is Logan Whitehorse, and you're going to remember everything now." Scar tried to speak, to deny it, but only a harsh rasp emerged from his damaged throat. The bullet that had torn through his neck 15 years ago had stolen not just his voice but his memories, his identity, his entire past. But Scar didn't know that the girl Ayanna was deliberately triggering his memories because her grandfather's vision had told her that only the return of Logan Whitehorse could prevent the coming war, and she had no idea that her words were about to unlock not just memories, but a truth that would put both their lives in mortal danger. "The mine," she said, watching his face carefully for any sign of recognition. "The silver mine your father discovered. It's still there, Logan, still producing, still making someone very rich." The desert heat shimmered around them, but Scar felt ice in his veins. "What mine?" "The Estrella mine. Richest silver strike in Arizona territory. Your father found it, registered it, died for it. And the man who killed him has been stealing from it ever since." Scar's hands began to shake. Not from the heat, but from something deeper. Memories were stirring in the depths of his mind like snakes awakening in the sun. But Scar didn't know that the Estrella mine was currently producing over $50,000 in silver every month, and that the man who had murdered his family to steal it was now Colonel Marcus Vega, the same officer assigned to negotiate the new Apache treaties. Who? Scar managed to rasp. "Colonel Marcus Vega, the butcher of Mesa Verde. The man who ordered your family's murder 15 years ago. And he's coming here, Logan. He's coming to finish what he started." The merciless sun beat down on them as Scar's world crumbled and reformed around him. Everything he thought he knew about his life was dissolving like a mirage in the desert heat. But Scar didn't know that 5 miles away, Colonel Vega was already riding toward their location with a company of cavalry, having discovered that Logan Whitehorse might still be alive and determined to eliminate the one witness who could expose his crimes. "Why are you telling me this?" Scar asked, his voice growing stronger as shock broke through the psychological barriers that had kept him silent for years. "Because my people are being driven from our ancestral lands. Because Vega has convinced the territorial governor that we're planning an uprising. Because in 2 days, if we don't sign his treaty and move to the reservation, he's going to attack our village with enough soldiers to kill every man, woman, and child." Ayanna struggled to sit up despite her wounds, her dark eyes blazing with desperate determination. But if Logan Whitehorse were alive, if the rightful owner of the Estrella mine demanded justice for his family's murder, it would expose Vega's lies and stop the massacre. "I don't remember being Logan Whitehorse," Scar said. But even as he spoke, more memories were surfacing. His father's booming laugh, his mother's gentle songs, the cool darkness of mine shafts and the gleam of silver in lantern light. But Scar didn't know that remembering everything would also mean reliving the most traumatic night of his life, the night he'd watched his parents die, the night a bullet had torn through his throat and left him for dead among the burning ruins of his childhood home. A dust cloud appeared on the horizon, moving fast across the desert floor. Hoofbeats thundered in the distance, growing closer by the second. Ayanna's eyes widened with sudden recognition. Apache riders. Many of them. My father's war party. Scar squinted through the heat shimmer and felt his blood turn to ice water. 30 mounted warriors were approaching at full gallop, their faces painted for war, their weapons glinting in the brutal sun. At their head rode a man who could only be Chief Lobo Fierro, a living legend whose very name struck fear into the hearts of soldiers and settlers alike. But Scar didn't know that Lobo Fierro was not just a war chief, but also his mother's brother, the uncle who had spent 15 years believing his nephew was dead, who had sworn by the sacred fire to raise him as his own son if he ever returned. The war party pulled up in a cloud of red dust, their horses snorting and stamping in the oppressive heat. Chief Lobo Fierro dismounted slowly, his weathered face a mask of controlled fury as he took in the scene, his daughter wounded and bloody, cradled in the arms of a white man. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of absolute command. "White man who holds my daughter, Explain why she bleeds. Scar helped Ayanna to her feet, supporting her weight as she swayed in the blazing heat. The sight of 30 armed warriors, their weapons trained on him while the sun baked the desert floor, was like something from his worst nightmares. Father, Ayanna said in Apache, this man saved my life. He found me dying and gave me his water. He asked nothing in return. Lobo Fierro's keen eyes studied Scar's face with an intensity that felt like physical pressure. There was something familiar about this young man's features, something that stirred memories of his beloved sister. What is your name? The chief demanded in English. Scar touched his throat and shook his head, indicating he couldn't speak clearly. But the effort of the last few minutes had loosened something in his damaged voice box. Scar, he managed to rasp. They call me Scar. Why do they call you this? Scar unbuttoned his shirt and pulled it aside to reveal the ugly white line that ran from just below his jaw to his collarbone, the mark of a bullet that had come within a hair's breadth of killing him. Lobo Fierro's eyes widened in shock. He said something rapid in Apache to his warriors, and several of them lowered their weapons. But Scar didn't know that the chief had just recognized the scar described in his father's dying vision, the mark of the lost nephew who would return when the desert burned red with war. Show me your eyes, Lobo Fierro commanded, stepping closer. Scar looked up, meeting the chief's gaze directly. In the blazing desert sunlight, his eyes were revealed to be not brown or green, but a startling blue, the exact shade of mountain lakes in winter. Maria del Cielo, Lobo Fierro whispered, using his sister's Apache name. Sky Woman, you have her eyes. The words triggered an avalanche of memories. Suddenly Scar could see her clearly, a beautiful Apache woman with kind eyes and gentle hands singing to him in 2 languages, teaching him that being different was a gift, not a curse. Logan Lobo Fierro said, and the name seemed to unlock the final barriers in Scar's damaged mind. Logan Aguila Blanca, White Eagle, my sister's son. The memories came flooding back now. Not just images, but emotions, sensations, the sound of his mother's laughter mixing with his father's stories of silver veins that ran deep into the earth. He remembered the mine, the claims, the fortune his father had worked so hard to build for his family's future. And he remembered the night it all ended. Soldiers coming in the darkness, setting fire to their home, shooting anyone who tried to escape. His mother pushing him toward the desert, telling him to run, to hide, to forget everything until it was safe to remember. Uncle, Logan said, his voice breaking as 15 years of buried grief came pouring out. I remember. But Logan didn't know that his uncle's arrival had come at the most crucial moment in Apache history, or that the man responsible for destroying his family was already riding toward them with orders to finish what he'd started 15 years ago. Lobo Fierro embraced his nephew, and around them the warriors began chanting not war songs but songs of welcome and return. But their reunion was cut short by the sound of approaching horses, moving fast across the desert floor. Soldiers, one of Lobo Fierro's scouts reported, pointing toward a dust cloud on the eastern horizon. 40 men, riding hard under a cavalry flag. Logan felt terror and rage war within his chest. Vega, you know this name? Lobo Fierro asked. He's the one who killed my parents. And if he's coming here, it's not for peaceful negotiations. But Logan didn't know that Vega had brought more than just soldiers. He'd also brought a territorial judge, who had already signed warrants for the arrest of Lobo Fierro and his hostile war party, based on falsified reports of raids and massacres that had never actually occurred. We cannot fight 40 cavalry in open desert, Lobo Fierro said grimly, his tactical mind already calculating odds and terrain, not without bringing disaster on our people. Then we don't fight, Logan replied, his voice growing stronger as his memories returned. We prove Vega is a murderer and a thief. How? Logan thought quickly, his father's lessons about law and evidence coming back to him. The mine, The Estrella mine has official records, ownership documents. If I can prove I'm Logan Whitehorse, the legal heir, it exposes everything Vega has done. But Logan didn't know that proving his identity would require more than just memories and family resemblance. It would require documents and witnesses that Vega had spent 15 years systematically destroying. The cavalry appeared over a ridge like a blue wave against the red desert, their horses kicking up clouds of dust in the brutal heat. At their head rode a man Logan recognized with a shock of terror that nearly dropped him to his knees. Colonel Marcus Vega looked exactly as Logan remembered from his nightmares, tall and lean with a carefully trimmed beard and eyes like chips of black obsidian. When he saw the gathering of Apache warriors, his hand moved instinctively to his saber. But Logan didn't know that Vega's shock at seeing him alive was mixed with relief. The colonel had been expecting this confrontation for years and had come prepared to eliminate the threat once and for all. "Chief Lobo Fierro," Vega called out, his voice carrying across the superheated air. "You and your men are in violation of territorial law. Disperse immediately or face military action." Lobo Fierro stepped forward, his dignity unshaken by the threat or the oppressive heat. "We are on Apache land, Colonel. We have broken no laws." "Apache land?" Vega's laugh was harsh as the desert wind. "This territory belongs to the United States government, as does your daughter, who was reported taken by hostile raiders." "I was not taken," Ayanna said clearly, stepping away from Logan to show she was free to move despite her injuries. "This man saved my life when I was dying of thirst and blood loss." Vega's gaze shifted to Logan, and for a moment something flickered across his face, recognition mixed with something that might have been fear. But Logan didn't know that Vega had recognized him immediately, and that the colonel's careful composure was hiding the panic of a man seeing a ghost from his past. "And you are?" Vega asked, his voice deceptively casual. Logan straightened, feeling his true identity settling over him like armor. "Logan Whitehorse, son of Miguel Whitehorse and Maria del Cielo, legal owner of the Estrella silver mine." The color drained from Vega's face so quickly that several of his own soldiers noticed. His horse pranced nervously in the heat, sensing his rider's sudden distress. "Impossible," Vega said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The Whitehorse family died in an Apache raid 15 years ago." "No," Logan replied, his voice carrying clearly across the desert. "They died in a cavalry attack. On your orders. I was there. I saw everything." But Logan didn't know that half of Vega's soldiers had no idea about their commander's past crimes, and that his revelation was about to split the military force into factions, some loyal to Vega, others horrified by what they were learning. "Even if that were true," Vega said, his hand moving toward his pistol, "you have no proof, no witnesses, no documents, nothing but the word of a half-breed vagrant." "I have this," Logan said, indicating the scar on his throat. "And I have my memories, every detail of that night, every order you gave, every innocent person you murdered for silver. Memories can be false, scars can have many explanations. What about mine records? What about the original claim documents filed in Tucson? What about the fact that you've been stealing $50,000 a month from my family's mine for 15 years? Vega's carefully maintained composure began to crack. Around him, his soldiers were shifting uneasily, some beginning to understand that their commander might not be the hero they'd believed him to be. But Logan didn't know that Vega had contingency plans for this exact scenario, plans that involved eliminating all witnesses and blaming their deaths on an Apache attack. "Stand down, men," Vega ordered his soldiers. "This situation requires careful handling." Several of the cavalry looked confused, but they followed orders, dismounting and spreading out in what appeared to be a peacekeeping formation but was actually preparation for a massacre. "Colonel," one of his lieutenants said quietly, wiping sweat from his brow in the oppressive heat, "if what this man is saying is true." "It's not true," Vega snapped. "He's clearly been brainwashed by these savages. filled with false memories to serve their political agenda. But Logan could see doubt creeping into the lieutenant's eyes, and he pressed his advantage. Ask him about the silver ore he's been selling in Mexico. Ask him about the bank accounts in El Paso. Ask him about the little Apache girl who begged for her life before he shot her in the back. Vega's composure finally shattered. Enough. I don't have to listen to these lies. He drew his pistol, but Lobo Firo was faster. The chief's rifle was already trained on the colonel's chest, despite the blazing heat that was making sweat pour down everyone's faces. I think you do, Lobo Fierro said calmly. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring in the desert heat. 40 soldiers facing 30 warriors, with Logan and Ayana caught in the middle. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning the canyon into a furnace where one wrong move would create a bloodbath. But Logan didn't know that help was already approaching. A federal marshal who had been investigating Vega's activities for months was riding hard across the desert, having finally gathered enough evidence to arrest the colonel for murder and theft. Let me tell you what's going to happen, Vega, Logan said, sweat running down his face but his voice steady. You're going to order your men to stand down. Then you're going to submit to federal investigation. And if you cooperate, maybe you'll live long enough to see the inside of a courtroom. And if I refuse? Logan gestured toward the warriors surrounding them, their weapons gleaming in the brutal sunlight. 30 Apache warriors have just heard you admit to murdering a woman they considered their sister. In this heat, with no water, how long do you think you'd last running across the desert? Vega looked around wildly, finally understanding that he was trapped. His own soldiers were beginning to back away from him, their loyalty shaken by what they'd witnessed, their uniforms soaked with sweat in the oppressive heat. You have no authority here, Vega said desperately. You're nobody. You own nothing. You are nothing. Actually, said a new voice from the ridge above them, he owns quite a lot. Everyone turned to see a man in a dark suit riding down into the canyon, a federal badge glinting on his vest. Behind him rode a small escort of U.S. Marshals, their horses lathered with sweat from hard riding in the desert heat. Marshal Thomas Rivera, the man announced as he approached, dismounting carefully in the blazing sun. And you must be Logan Whitehorse. We've been looking for you for quite some time. But Logan didn't know that Marshal Rivera had been his father's business partner years ago, and that he'd spent 15 years investigating Vega's crimes, waiting for enough evidence to bring him to justice. Marshal, Vega said, trying to regain his composure despite the sweat pouring down his face. Perfect timing. I was just arresting these criminals for violation of federal treaty obligations. Were you now? Marshal Rivera smiled grimly, pulling out a thick leather folder despite the heat. That's interesting because I have warrants here for your arrest, Colonel. Multiple counts of murder, theft of mineral rights, and falsification of government documents. Vega's world crumbled in the desert heat. This is a conspiracy, a plot by savage sympathizers to undermine legitimate military authority. Actually, Marshal Rivera said, opening the folder to reveal dozens of documents, it's the result of a very thorough investigation, including testimony from miners who were willing to swear that you've been stealing silver and selling it through illegal channels. He turned to Logan, squinting in the blazing sunlight. Son, I have some documents here that might interest you. Your father's original mine claims, for instance, and the partnership agreement he signed with me before his death, and approximately $4 million in silver that's been extracted from your mine over the past 15 years. Logan's knees nearly buckled despite the desert heat. $4 million, more wealth than he could comprehend, more than he could spend in several lifetimes. There's also this, Marshal Rivera continued, handing Logan a small leather journal. Your father's records. He suspected Vega was planning something, and he documented everything, including his discovery that Vega was working with Mexican silver smugglers. Logan opened the journal with trembling hands, seeing his father's familiar handwriting on pages yellowed with age and heat. The final entry was dated the day before his family's murder. "If anything happens to me," Logan read aloud, "the truth can be found in the hidden shaft behind the old cabin. I've cached evidence there that will expose Vega for what he really is. I pray Logan will never need to use it, but if he does, he'll know where to look." Vega made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. In the oppressive heat and swirling tension, he lunged for his rifle, probably planning to shoot Logan and claim self-defense in the chaos. But Ayanna was faster than anyone expected. Despite her injuries and the exhaustion from the desert heat, she threw herself between Vega and Logan, taking the bullet meant for the man who had saved her life. The gunshot echoed off the canyon walls like thunder. Ayanna crumpled to the hot sand, blood spreading across her already stained dress, her body steaming in the brutal heat. No. Logan's anguished cry seemed to shake the very desert. Vega never got a chance to fire a second shot. Lobo Fiero's rifle barked once, and the colonel pitched backward from his horse, a neat hole through his heart, his blood quickly soaking into the thirsty sand. Logan knelt beside Ayanna in the blazing heat, cradling her head while the sun beat down mercilessly. Her breathing was shallow, her face pale despite the oppressive temperature. "Why?" he whispered, sweat and tears mixing on his face. "Why did you do that?" She smiled weakly, her hand finding his cheek despite the heat exhaustion. Because grandfather's vision showed me something else. Showed me that saving your life was the only way to save our people." "You're not going to die," Logan said fiercely, even as the desert heat seemed to be stealing her life away. "I won't let you." But even as he spoke, he could see her life ebbing away like water in the sand. The bullet had found her heart, and there was nothing anyone could do in this remote canyon. "Logan," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the desert wind. "Promise me something. Anything. Use your fortune. Use your voice to build something better. A world where Apache children and white children can learn together. Where being different is a strength, not a reason for war." Logan felt tears evaporating on his cheeks in the dry heat. "I promise." Ayanna's eyes closed, and Logan felt something tear loose inside his chest. This brave, beautiful woman had died saving him, just as his mother had died protecting him 15 years earlier. But Logan didn't know that Ayanna's sacrifice would become the foundation of the most ambitious peace initiative in Western history, or that her death would inspire him to use his inherited wealth in ways that would transform the entire Southwest. Marshal Rivera approached quietly, removing his hat despite the blazing sun. "I'm sorry for your loss, son." She was a remarkable young woman. Lobo Fiero knelt beside his daughter's body, his weathered face carved from stone despite the sweat running down his cheeks. When he looked up at Logan, his eyes held not blame but understanding. "She chose well," the chief said simply. "She chose to save the man who could save us all." In the weeks that followed, as Logan began the complex process of reclaiming his inheritance and identity, he discovered that Ayanna had been right about everything. The White Horse fortune was vast enough to fund schools, hospitals, and trading posts throughout the territory. It was enough to hire lawyers who could protect Apache rights, and enough to buy water rights that could be shared between communities. But most importantly, it was enough to build something unprecedented in the desert Southwest, a community where two cultures could coexist and learn from each other. The first school opened 6 months later in a valley where a natural spring provided precious water, with classes taught in both English and Apache. The first hospital followed soon after, staffed by doctors who treated all patients regardless of race. And gradually, carefully, Logan began building the world Ayanna had envisioned with her dying breath. It wasn't easy. The desert was harsh and unforgiving. Resources were scarce, and there were people on both sides who preferred the old ways of suspicion and hatred. But for every step backward, Logan's growing community took 2 steps forward. Lobo Fiero became more than just an ally. He became the father Logan had lost, teaching him the ancient wisdom of desert survival and the sacred traditions of his mother's people. And in return, Logan used his resources and connections to protect the chief's tribe from the worst excesses of government policy. 3 years later, Logan stood on the porch of the school he'd built in Ayana's memory, watching Apache and white children playing together in the shade of ramadas built to protect them from the blazing sun. Their laughter carried on the hot desert wind, a sound of hope that would have made his mother proud. He touched the scar on his throat. No longer a mark of shame, but a reminder of how far he'd traveled to find himself. The bullet that had stolen his voice for so many years had also taught him the value of listening, of understanding pain that couldn't be spoken. And what he'd learned by listening was that peace wasn't something you achieved once and kept forever. It was something you built every day, one choice at a time, one act of courage at a time, one shared drink of precious water at a time. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the desert sky in shades of gold and crimson, Logan Whitehorse, once known as Scar, the voiceless drifter who'd had nothing, felt richer than any man had a right to be. Because he'd learned that the greatest fortune wasn't silver you could dig from the ground, but the community you could build under the endless sky. And he'd discovered that sometimes the most profound changes begin with sharing your last drop of water with a stranger dying in the heat. The scar on his throat would always remind him of the night he'd lost everything. But the school, the hospital, the community flourishing in the desert, these would remind the world that even in the harshest conditions, hope could take root and grow. If this story moved you, remember that every act of kindness creates ripples that can survive even the most brutal conditions. Subscribe for more tales of courage, redemption, and the power of choosing compassion over hatred. The next story is waiting, and it will show you that sometimes the greatest victories bloom in the most unlikely places.